Welcome to the RPTM podcast, the show that breaks down the myths of monolithic history and tells our story through multiple lenses. I'm your host, Professor RyanGLancaster. Today's episode is partially underwritten by you, the listener. Find out ways to support the podcast on my website, RyanGLancaster.com. Episode 42, Dred Scott, Lincoln Douglas, and Temporary Insanity. As you have heard me say repeatedly, history is not monolithic. The truth is the same, and the lines get blurry with dissenters within the ranks. The quest for understanding could become limited by the historically minded elite, and a lone historian typing away on his computer could be overcome by a coalition of experts. Please do not believe the internet's persistence has eroded our public discourse of misinformation. Experts do not have a monopoly on the search for truth. The internet has enhanced the historical method by allowing anyone to speak up and question general knowledge regardless of their expertise or certifications. Most extreme historical arguments don't pan out, but trial and error are integral to the process. Archaeological evidence doesn't show any proof of horned helmets on Vikings. Death sites instead tell us most Viking warriors went bareheaded or wore leather headgear. This widespread, albeit false, the image of brawny men striding into battle with horns dates to the 1800s when artists included the imagery in their work. Some operas also had costumes with horned helmets. It's not to say that historical establishment's uncredentialed challenges should be silenced or cut out of the discussion. Still, life-changing findings often come from dissenters who threaten institutional thinking. We must welcome dissidents. Even random people on the internet with no academic certificates might have groundbreaking ideas, and sometimes reacting to bad ideas could lead to good ones. Academic training can make it easier to catch cherry-picking historical events and comprehend what the evidence says. But I can tell you, as a history professor with years of background, examining historical evidence, knowledge, and credentials can cause short-sightedness, making it harder to see the worth in radically new views. Once a theory becomes marked conservative or liberal, it becomes difficult for historians to question it. History can be occasionally so politicized that those who break from the faith are often denounced as cranks and are threatened to be kicked off social media platforms for damaging misinformation. But openness to unconventional theories has its limits. For example, the trains were never widely or uniformly on time in Mussolini's era. This legend likely arose from the fascist propaganda promoting Mussolini's exploits beyond reality. Trains were a significant part of commerce and travel, so prompt and efficient train systems would have been an important selling point for any statesman who could truthfully claim it. But in this case, it just wasn't true. That being said, the best experts show tolerance, consideration, and openness to outsiders' views. History is a discipline, not a priesthood.
Dred Scott. Dred Scott versus Sandford was a landmark decision of the United States Supreme Court. The court held that the United States Constitution did not include American citizenship for people of African descent, regardless of whether enslaved or free. So the rights and privileges that the Constitution confers upon American citizens could not apply to them. In the case of Dred Scott, judges decided that an enslaved black man whose owners had taken him from Missouri, a slaveholding state, into Illinois and the Wisconsin Territory, where slavery was illegal. When his owners later brought him back to Missouri, Scott sued in court for his freedom. He claimed that because his master had taken him into free U.S. territory, he had automatically been freed and was legally no longer a slave. Scott sued first in Missouri State Court, which ruled that he was still an enslaved person under its law. He then sued in U.S. Federal Court, which ruled against him by deciding to apply Missouri law to the case. He then appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. In March 1857, the Supreme Court issued a 7-2 decision against Dred Scott. In an opinion written by Chief Justice Roger Taney, the court ruled that people of African descent are not included, and were not intended to be included, under the word citizens in the Constitution, and can therefore claim none of the rights and privileges which that instrument provides for and secures to citizens of the United States. Taney supported his ruling with a comprehensive survey of American state and local laws from the time of the Constitution's drafting in 1787 that purported to show that a perpetual and impassable barrier was intended to be erected between the white race and the one which they had reduced to slavery. Because the court ruled that Scott was not an American citizen, he was also not a citizen of any state and, accordingly, could never establish the diversity of citizenship that Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution requires for a U.S. federal court to be able to exercise jurisdiction over a case. After ruling on those issues surrounding Scott, Taney continued further and struck down the entire Missouri Compromise to limit slavery that exceeded the U.S. Congress's constitutional powers. Historians discovered that after the Supreme Court heard arguments in the case, but before issuing a ruling, President-elect James Buchanan wrote to his friend, U.S. Supreme Court Associate Justice John Catron, to ask whether the Supreme Court would decide the case before his inauguration in March 1857. Buchanan hoped that the decision would quell unrest in the country over the slavery issue by issuing a ruling to take it out of the political debate. Buchanan later successfully pressured Associate Justice Robert Cooper Greer, a Northerner, to join the Southern majority in Dred Scott to prevent judges' appearance from decided sectional lines. Buchanan's use of political pressure on a member of a sitting court was regarded then, as now, to be highly improper. Republicans fueled speculation about Buchanan's influence by publicizing that Taney had secretly informed Buchanan of the decision. Buchanan declared in his inaugural address that the slavery question would be speedily and finally settled by the Supreme Court. Many Republicans, including Abraham Lincoln, who was rapidly becoming the leading Republican in Illinois, regarded the decision as part of a plot to expand and eventually impose the legalization of slavery throughout all states. Some Southern extremists wanted all states to recognize slavery as a constitutional right. Lincoln rejected the court's majority opinion that the right of property in a slave is distinctly and expressly affirmed in the Constitution, pointing out that the Constitution did not even mention the property of enslaved people and explicitly referred to them as persons. Southern Democrats considered Republicans to be lawless rebels who were provoking disunion by refusing to accept the Supreme Court's decision on the law of the land. Many Northern opponents of slavery offered a legal argument for refusing to recognize the Dred Scott decision on the Missouri Compromise as binding. They argued that the court's determination that the federal courts had no jurisdiction to hear the case rendered the remainder of the decision obiter dictum, a non-critical passing remark rather than an authoritative interpretation of the law. Although Taney and several other justices hoped the decision would permanently settle the slavery controversy, which was increasingly dividing the American public, the decision's effect was the complete opposite. Taney's majority opinion suited the slaveholding states, but was intensely decried in all the other states. The decision inflamed the national debate over slavery and deepened the divide that ultimately led to the Civil War.
The Lincoln-Douglas Debates. The Lincoln-Douglas debates were a series of 7 debates between Abraham Lincoln, the Republican Party candidate for the United States Senate from Illinois, and incumbent Senator Stephen Douglas, the Democratic Party candidate. Until the 17th Constitutional Amendment of 1913, senators were elected by their respective state legislatures, so Lincoln and Douglas tried to win control of the Illinois General Assembly for their respective parties. The debates were designed to generate publicity, the first examples of what later would be called media events. For Lincoln, they were an opportunity to raise his national profile and the burgeoning Republican Party. At the same time, Douglas sought to defend his record, especially his leading role in the doctrine of popular sovereignty and its incarnation in the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. The candidates spoke in each of Illinois' 9 congressional districts. Both candidates had already said in Springfield and Chicago within a day, so they decided that their joint appearances would be held in the remaining 7 districts. Each debate lasted around 3 hours. One candidate spoke for 60 minutes, followed by a 90-minute response and a final 30-minute rejoinder by the first candidate. The candidates alternated speaking first. As the incumbent, Douglas said first in 4 of the debates. Weather permitting, they were held outdoors, from about 2 to 5 p.m. There were fields full of listeners. The debates focused on slavery, specifically, whether it would be allowed in the new states to be formed from the territory acquired through the Louisiana Purchase and the Mexican Cession. As part of the Democratic Party, Douglas held that the decision should be made by the residents of the new states themselves rather than by the federal government. Lincoln argued against the expansion of slavery yet stressed that he was not advocating its abolition where it already existed. Never in American history had there been newspaper coverage of such intensity. Both candidates felt they were talking to the whole nation. New technology was readily available: railroads, the telegraph, and Pitman shorthand called phonography. From Chicago, the state's largest newspaper sent stenographers to report complete texts of each debate. Thanks to the new railroads, the debates were not hard to reach from Chicago. Halfway through each debate, runners were handed the stenographer's notes. They raced for the next train to Chicago, passing them to riding stenographers who, during the journey, converted the shorthand back into words, producing a transcript ready for the Chicago typesetter and the telegrapher, who sent it to the rest of the country as soon as it arrived. The next train brought the conclusion. The papers published the speeches in full, sometimes within hours of delivery. Some newspapers helped their candidate with minor corrections, reports on the audience's positive reaction, or tendentious headlines. The newswire of the Associated Press sent messages simultaneously to multiple points, so newspapers all across the country printed them, and the debates quickly became national events. They were republished as pamphlets. Douglas was first elected to the United States Senate in 1846 and sought re-election for a third term in 1858. The issue of slavery was raised several times during his tenure in the Senate, particularly concerning the Compromise of 1850. As chairman of the Committee on U.S. Territories, he argued for an approach to slavery called popular sovereignty. Electorates in the territories would vote whether to adopt or reject slavery. Douglas was successful with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. Previously, decisions were made at the federal level concerning slavery in the territories. Lincoln was also elected to Congress in 1846 and served a 2-year term in the House of Representatives. During his time in the House, he disagreed with Douglas and supported the Wilmot Proviso, which sought to ban slavery in any new territory. He returned to politics in the 1850s to oppose the Kansas-Nebraska Act and help develop the new Republican Party. Before the debates, Lincoln charged that Douglas was encouraging fears of amalgamation of the races, with enough success to drive thousands of people away from the Republican Party. Douglas replied that Lincoln was an abolitionist for saying that the American Declaration of Independence applied to blacks and whites. Lincoln argued in his House-divided speech that Douglas was part of a conspiracy to nationalize slavery. Lincoln said that ending the Missouri Compromise ban on slavery in Kansas and Nebraska was the first step in this nationalizing. The Dred Scott decision was another step towards spreading slavery into northern territories. He expressed the fear that any similar Supreme Court decision would turn Illinois into a slave state. The debates took place between August and October 1858. The debates near Illinois' borders drew large numbers of people from neighboring states. A number traveled within Illinois to follow the debates. Douglas was re-elected by the Illinois General Assembly, 54-46. The publicity made Lincoln a national figure and laid the groundwork for his 1860 presidential campaign. Recent improvements in technology were fundamental to the debate's success and popularity. New railroads connected major cities at high speeds, a message that on a horse would have taken a week arrived in hours. A forgotten soft technology, Pitman shorthand, allowed writing to keep up with speech, far closer to a recording than had been possible before. Finally, messages could now be sent at the speed of light via the electrical telegraph, anywhere east of the Rocky Mountains. The combination of shorthand, the telegraph, and the railroad changed everything. It was unprecedented. Lincoln and Douglas knew they were speaking to the whole nation. The October election surprise was former Whig John J. Crittenden's endorsement of Douglas. Non-Republican former Whigs comprised the biggest bloc of swing voters, and Crittenden's favor of Douglas rather than Lincoln reduced Lincoln's chances of winning. Leadership drew the districts to favor Douglas's party, and the Democrats won 40 seats in the state House of Representatives while the Republicans won 35. Republicans held 11 seats in the state Senate, and Democrats had 14. Douglas was re-elected by the legislature 54-46, even though Republican candidates for the state legislature received 24,094 more votes than candidates supporting Douglas. However, The widespread media coverage of the debate significantly raised Lincoln's national profile, making him a viable candidate for nomination as the Republican candidate in the upcoming 1860 presidential election.
Congressman Daniel Sickles. Before becoming a Civil War general, Congressman Dan E. Sickles' shameful murder trial changed our legal system forever. In 1859, Congressman Dan Sickles pulled out a pistol and shot his wife's lover. Standing in full view of the White House, Sickles screamed, "You scoundrel, you have dishonored my house, you must die." The shocking crime made headlines worldwide, and Sickles became the first person in American history to plead temporary insanity to get away with murder. Dan Sickles earned a law degree and seduced a teenager before being elected to Congress, the son of a wealthy New York family. Sickles was 33 when he married 16-year-old Teresa Baggioli. When he was elected to the House of Representatives in 1856, the couple took Washington, D.C. by storm, becoming fixtures in high society. Both Dan and Teresa pursued affairs. Dan also had a reputation for visiting brothels, but only Teresa's flirting raised eyebrows. In the 19th century, a wife's affair transformed her husband into a cuckold, undermining his masculinity, while a husband's affairs were simply business as usual. In 1858, Teresa carried on an affair with Barton Key, a close friend of Congressman Sickles and the son of Francis Scott Key, who penned the lyrics to the Star-Spangled Banner. According to Dan Sickles, Teresa's affair drove him to murder. One D.C. gossip columnist called Key the most handsome man in all Washington society. Key signaled Teresa by waving his pocket handkerchief on the street. The pair would meet at an abandoned house only steps from the White House, where Teresa confessed, "I did what is usual for a wicked woman to do." Everything changed on February 24, 1859, when Sickles received an anonymous letter. The enraged congressman confronted Teresa and forced her to write a confession. 3 days later, Sickles spotted Key outside his home, waving his handkerchief to signal Teresa. "That villain is out there now making signs," Sickles raged. Grabbing 3 guns, Sickles rushed out to confront Key. Sickles fired his pistol before Key could say a word. Key threw a pair of opera glasses at Sickles and tried to hide behind a tree, but Sickles continued to fire until a bystander wrestled him to the ground. Sickles had gunned down Key in Lafayette Park on a sunny Sunday afternoon. With no chance of escape, Sickles took a carriage to the home of Attorney General Jeremiah S. Black, where he surrendered. The sensational murder became front-page news. The tragic affair produced a great sensation, the New York Herald. In the streets, the law courts, public houses, private dwellings and, in fact, everywhere, it was the prominent topic of conversation. Even President James Buchanan took sides in the sensational case. He sent a letter of support to the imprisoned congressman. From jail, Sickles gave interviews with the press. "He has dishonored me, and we could not live together on the same planet," Sickles told one paper. Harper's Weekly judged the outcome before the trial began. "The public of the United States will justify him in killing the man who dishonored his bed." Dan Sickles, who admitted firing the shots that killed Key, hoped the jury would agree. Congressman Dan Sickles hired 8 defense attorneys to represent him during his trial. One of them, John Graham, spent a full 2 days on his opening statement defending Sickles. "Adultery was evil," Graham intoned, quoting Shakespeare's Othello to justify Sickles' actions. Discovering the affair had made Sickles temporarily insane. Temporary insanity was a new concept in American courts. While defendants had pleaded insanity before, no one had claimed to be insane only temporarily. But Graham relied on the jury's sympathy towards Sickles to justify the murder. The trial also painted Teresa Sickles as a prostitute and murderer. One defense attorney argued that a wife who surrendered to the adulterer longed for her own husband's death, either by the cup of the poisoner or the dagger or pistol of the assassin. Another attorney added that the affair pulled Teresa toward the horrid filth that is common prostitution. Dan Sickles painted himself as the avenger of the invaded household. His wife was an immoral woman. and Key deserved to die. Dan Sickles' attorneys argued both at the same time. The presiding judge didn't put much stock in the temporary insanity defense. In his jury instructions on April 26, Judge Crawford warned the jurors that a gap between Sickles' learning of the affair and killing Keyes weighed the scales toward premeditated murder, and Sickles had spent 3 days plotting his revenge after receiving the anonymous note. Yet it only took the jury an hour to declare Dan Sickles not guilty because of temporary insanity. From the start, many predicted Sickles would walk for his crime. During jury selection, 72 of the first 75 prospective jurors were excused for sympathizing with the murderer. The packed courtroom burst into applause, and 1,500 people led Sickles through the streets in an impromptu victory parade. "We regard this as a most mistaken and mischievous verdict," declared the Tribune. "It is a verdict which carries this country a long stride backward toward the age when might be right, and all wrongs were redressed by the red hand, or not at all." The trial turned Dan Sickles into a nationally known figure. But his actions after the trial kept Sickles in the headlines for decades. Shortly after his acquittal, Sickles and his wife Teresa publicly reconciled, drawing criticism from their peers in Washington and the press. Next, Sickles left his congressional seat in 1860, quickly turning around to raise a brigade of men for the Civil War. As a general, Sickles led troops at Gettysburg, where he ignored his superior officers' orders and lost a leg to a cannonball. After the trial, Dan Sickles became a Civil War general who fought at Gettysburg and died in 1914. As an ambassador to Spain after the war, Sickles seduced the Queen, and in his final years, Sickles was accused of stealing public funds. The legacy of Dan Sickles' trial outlived Sickles himself. While his case represents the first successful temporary insanity plea, the jury almost certainly didn't buy that defense. Instead, Victorian moralists decided that Key had it coming. Yet even though Dan Sickles' trial says more about 19th century views of masculinity and women's sexuality, the ruling still broke new legal ground. Even an infamous philanderer like Sickles could claim piety if cuckolded. In the past 150 years, the temporary insanity defense has become a mainstay in the American legal system.
Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. Walt Whitman was an American poet, essayist, and journalist. He was a humanist transitioning between transcendentalism and realism, incorporating both views in his works. Whitman is among the most influential poets in the American canon, often called the father of free verse. His work was controversial in its time, particularly his poetry collection Leaves of Grass, which was described as obscene for its overt sensuality. Whitman's own life came under scrutiny for his presumed homosexuality. Born in Huntington on Long Island, Whitman worked as a journalist, a teacher, and a government clerk. At age 11, he left formal schooling to go to work. As a child and throughout his career, he resided in Brooklyn. Whitman's major work, Leaves of Grass, was first published in 1855 with his own money. The result was an attempt at reaching out to the ordinary person with an American epic. He continued expanding and revising it until his death in 1892. He went to Washington, D.C., and worked in hospitals caring for the wounded during the American Civil War. His poetry often focused on both loss and healing. Two of his well-known poems, O Captain, My Captain, and When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed, were written after the death of Abraham Lincoln. After a stroke towards the end of his life, Whitman moved to Camden, New Jersey, where his health further declined. When he died at age 72, his funeral was a public event. Though biographers debate Whitman's sexuality, he is usually described as either homosexual or bisexual in his feelings and attractions. Whitman's sexual orientation is generally assumed based on his poetry, though this assumption has been disputed. His poetry depicts love and sexuality in a more earthy, individualistic way common in American culture before the medicalization of sexuality in the late 19th century. Whitman had intense friendships with many men and boys throughout his life. Some biographers have suggested that he may not have had sexual relationships with males. Peter Doyle may be the most likely candidate for the love of Whitman's life. Doyle was a bus conductor whom Whitman met around 1866, and the two were inseparable for several years. Interviewed in 1895, Doyle said, "We were familiar at once. I put my hand on his knee. We understood. He did not get out at the end of the trip and went back with me." Whitman disguised Doyle's initials in his notebooks using the code 16.4, PD being the 16th and 4th letters of the alphabet. By contrast, Emily Dickinson lived the sheltered life of a genteel unmarried woman in small-town Amherst, Massachusetts. Her poetry is ingenious, witty, and penetrating. Her work was unconventional for its day, and little of it was published during her lifetime. Many of her poems dwell on death, often with a naughty twist. The extensive use of dashes, unconventional capitalization in Dickinson's manuscripts, and the distinctive vocabulary and imagery combine to create a body of work far more varied in its styles and forms than is commonly supposed. Emily Dickinson's life and works have been the inspiration to artists, particularly feminist-oriented artists, of various mediums. She has been regarded, alongside Emerson, as a transcendentalist. Dickinson left no formal statement of her aesthetic intentions, and because of the variety of her themes, her work does not fit conveniently into any genre.
You've been listening to the RPTM podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate us on whatever platform you're listening on. Join us again next week when we talk about the seen and unseen of U.S. history. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, for more information, check out the show notes on my website. The show was produced by me. Our editor is me. Written and researched by me. Music is Down South by Bliv Beats. I'm Ryan Lancaster, and this was the RPTM podcast.